Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, the Russians have advanced across the front line in multiple directions. We start out in the north in the direction of Sinkyvka, where the Russians have made small advances along the forest patch to the northwest of Sinkyvka and to the east of Sinkyvka. The Russians are here doing positional fighting around Sinkyvka to improve their positions ahead of fighting within the village. It has become clear that the strength of the Ukrainians in the area does not come from Sinkyvka, but from the surrounding areas, including the massive forest area west of the village, as well as the positions to the east that prevent a Russian breakthrough and consolidation of gains within the village itself. So the Russians are now moving to capture everything around Sinkyvka before moving into Sinkyvka itself, similar to how they do across the front line in other directions. So we're seeing positional fighting along the Sinkyvka direction, where the Russians have advanced slightly within the forest area and to the east of the village. In the southern direction here, in the direction of Borova, the deep state map reports of a significant buildup of Russian troops in the area. They claim that the Russians are preparing over 10,000 soldiers in this section of the front line, as is seen in this picture here. We see that the Russians in this picture are building up their forces along the foothold they have gained across the Serebets river line. From this, we see that the Russians, according to Deep State Map, are planning an assault on Borova, making advantage of the foothold that they gained last year to push through along the roads towards the Ukrainian series of villages and push towards Borova. According to Deep State Map, over 10,000 soldiers and 450 pieces of military equipment, including 200 pieces of artillery, has been prepared in this section, and they are going to use that for a push towards Borova. If the Russians manage to do this and achieve success along this road, pushing through along Makiyivka, Rekivka to the south, Rozdolivka in the center, and Raiba in the north, we will likely see the Russians completely take control over the area, which will separate the northern and southern parts of the front. This will allow the Russians to fight along the river line, which will remove the aspect of these open fields, making it difficult for Russians to advance and gather troops in the area, and at the same time it will allow the Russians to concentrate at one at a time rather than both at the same time or along the entirety of the front line. Being able to concentrate their forces in a shorter area will allow the Russians to strengthen their positions in that area. At the same time, we've seen a lot of positional fighting near Sinkyvka and to the north. This is a clear evidence that the Russians are looking to gain control over the northern parts of the Serbets river line, securing that flank ahead of this operation. So this operation will likely take place following the Russian capture of Sinkyvka to the north. After that, the Russians will have a secure flank in the northern direction and likely launch this operation towards Borova. I agree with Deep State's analysis and that this is likely the course of action the Russians will take in an assault towards Borova. Further south here in the direction of Rozdolivka, the Russians have assaulted the village from the southwest, capturing the majority of the fortified positions and gaining an inch closer towards the village from the southwest. With this, the Russians will likely adapt the front line. As I mentioned previously, the Russians are looking to gain control over the fortified positions, to gain control over the southern part, which will allow them to concentrate their forces and launch an assault within the village with control over the eastern and southern parts of it. Further south here in the direction of the Avdiivka section of the front line, the Russians have advanced in three separate directions. In the direction of Yasnobrodivka, the Russians have gained a foothold in the southeastern outskirts, capturing the fortified position and likely going to move on further towards the main parts of the village. The village itself is pretty much non-existent. There are only these fortified positions to the south and to the east of it. The Russians are attacking from the southern direction, which is less fortified than the eastern one, which has this singular fortified position. The village itself consists of nothing really significant. There's just a few areas here in the south, and then there's a few buildings further north. What matters is the fortified positions, and the Russians are assaulting these right now. This means that the settlement will likely fall into Russian hands soon. Further west, there's just forest patches and forest lines, and therefore the Russians likely will gain control over Yasnobrodivka and then concentrate their forces towards the two lakes here by the Vovcha River and allow the Russians to gain control over this section here, which will then push the Russians to concentrate their forces in the direction of Karelivka to the south. and send additional forces to the north by Umansky, where they can attack in multiple directions, or down south towards Nevelsky, where they'll flank the Ukrainian fortified positions. Therefore, the push here by Yasnobrodivka is likely to improve the positions of the Russian forces in the area and to develop the offensive operations to the north and to the south. North of Sokil, the Russians have stormed the Ukrainian fortified positions, gained control and a foothold over a forest line here to the north of the village, and majority of the fortified positions, as is seen with this geolocated footage. With this, we see that the Russians are storming through the fortified positions north of Sokil. As I mentioned, the Russians will have a hard time gaining control over Sokil without capturing the fortified positions to the north, due to the high ground advantage and fortified positions overlooking the village. If the Russians gain control of these fortified positions, they can move in a northern direction towards the next ones, and then they will have a secure hold over the northern parts, which will then allow the Russians to focus on the southern parts towards Rozdolivka Persha along the main road from Sokil down to the town. At the same time, they have gained control of Pokrovsk to the east and Umansky to the south, allowing for assaults from every single direction, from the north, east, and south. The Russians have multiple times attempted to assault Rozdolivka Persha, but have so far been unable to gain a foothold within the town. Assaults happen from the east, south, and southeast, as Russians improve their positions bit by bit along the main roads from the east and the south, as well as positional fighting by Novopokrovsk, where they have managed to gain full control over the village and are pushing along the forest line towards the town. However, they are facing a lot of Ukrainian FPV drones in the south and southeast. In the north, by Sokil, positional fighting and trench warfare is taking place as Russians push through these trenches north of the village to gain control over their fortified positions, which will significantly improve the Russian positions in the area. Sokil is largely unmanned by the Ukrainians, who do not have enough manpower to stay in every single house like they did in Bakhmut or other major regional fighting with a lot of street fighting. So the Ukrainians are largely concentrated in the fortified positions, giving them better positions than the village itself. Therefore, if the Russians gain full control over the fortified position, they would likely advance further within the village itself. The same with the positions and fortified areas north of Sokil. If the Russians gain control over this entire section, they'll be able to push towards Sinkyvka and Voshchod, which will allow the Russians to push down south. And again, gaining control over fortified positions north of Rozdolivka Persha will limit the Ukrainian defensive capabilities within the town itself. Moving further south here in the direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have managed to advance slightly south of the town, and with this we see, as I predicted, the Russians are going to be launching assaults towards this fortified position from the north and the south at the same time, from the direction of Pobieda and from Krasnohorivka. This is to improve their position. Gaining control over this fortified area will allow for a large buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, and that will allow the Russians to concentrate their forces towards a push towards Krasnohorivka. So we're seeing a lot of developments across the front, with the Russians advancing across the entirety of the east and the south. The Russians are here focusing the majority of their manpower in the east, while having only a small part in the north. We have to remember that the Russians initiated the Kharkiv offensive with only 4,000 soldiers and have since then increased their amount to about 10,000, which is what the Russians are focusing in this small section by Borova compared to the north. We see that the Russians will likely attempt to push through to improve their positions. However, we have not seen that the Russians have been able to succeed in last year's assault, so we have to see how much the situation has changed since then. The Ukrainians still have a lot of fortified positions, which are not to be underestimated, as they give a significant advantage to the Ukrainians on the defense, while the defensive positions are generally having an advantage in the first place. So we see that the Russians do have the initiative on where they are going to push as long as they are on the offensive. But this also means that they need to have a strong fist to be able to break through the Ukrainian lines. Otherwise, they'll just be bogged down and continue this attritional war that we have been seeing for the past years. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.